I re-ranked this list 14 times. Every year I tell myself, it'll be easier next time. And every year, I'm wrong. 2025 wasn't just a good year for movies. It was the kind of year that makes you defensive about your favourites. The kind of year that starts arguments in the comment sections before the video is even uploaded. But nothing prepared me for the war I had with myself over the number one spot. Because at the top of my list, there were two films. On one side, K-pop Demon Hunters. A neon-drenched fever dream of choreography, mythology, and pure pop maximalism. It's loud, it's chaotic, it shouldn't work. And somehow, it absolutely does. And on the other, Sinners. Quiet, intimate, devastating. The kind of film that doesn't ask for your attention, it demands your confession. One made me want to stand up and scream in a crowded theatre. The other made me sit there through the credits, unable to move. And I kept asking myself the same question. What does number one even mean? Is it scale? Impact? Rewatchability? Craft? Cultural shockwave? Or is it that gut punch feeling when you realise you're watching something that shouldn't exist, but does? I changed my mind after my second watch, then again after my third. And then I flipped them the night before recording this. This list nearly broke me. But after weeks of obsessing, debating, and probably overthinking it, I finally landed on an answer. And if you think you already know what my number one is, trust me, you don't. I am not kidding with that cold open. Genuinely not kidding. That's how difficult this list was to make. Last minute omissions, and that's how difficult this year was to put together. But nevertheless, I did it, and this is it. So I'm going to take this from my gaming channel. Hello there, and welcome to what has been highly anticipated, something that's about 6 weeks overdue. But we did it, and we're ready to go. This is the one every film fan waits for every year. This is the one every filming YouTuber like myself spends countless hours putting together over the course of 12 months, an entire calendar year, with how many films they go to see, be it in cinemas or in streaming. Top 10 films of the year. This is the big one. We've just had the start of the second half of this decade, and well, where do we begin? So, just before we get into the list itself, I'm gonna put together a list of things that need to be fulfilled in order to be eligible for this list. As I have often done since my 2020 films list, if the film has a UK release date of this particular year, in this case, if it had a 2025 UK release date, it is eligible for this list. So, I know I'm going to address the elephant in the room here. There's going to be one comment, and I guarantee you're typing that comment right now. Didn't this come out in 2024? In some cases, yes. But like I said, I am going for UK release date. If a film officially released in UK cinemas or had its primary UK rollout in 2025, it's eligible. And that does mean some films premiered earlier elsewhere. A few hit festivals in 2024, some had limited US releases before crossing the Atlantic. But for UK audiences, including myself, 2025 is where they landed. And the second rule is, and this is the most important one, these are only films I've actually watched. No placeholders, no, I've heard it's amazing, so it's probably top 5, no prestige guessing. If it's on this list, it's because I sat with it, I experienced it, I wrestled with it, and in some cases, I rewatched it just to be sure I wasn't caught up in the opening week hype. Because for me, a year-end list isn't about predicting consensus. It's about documenting what genuinely moved me, what lingered, what challenged me, what I couldn't stop thinking about weeks later. So this isn't necessarily the definitive top 10 films of 2025. It's my personal top 10. My top 10 is going to be different from yours. Your top 10 is going to be different from somebody else's. And then that somebody else is going to have a completely different top 10 list from everybody else around the world. And that's okay. This top 10 is filtered through my taste, my context, and my slightly obsessive re-ranking process. And yes, that process absolutely spiraled completely out of control when it came to deciding between K-pop Demon Hunters and Sinners for that number 1 spot. But we'll get to that eventually. So with all that said, UK release, personal viewing, no hypotheticals, let's get started. Because at number 10, and honestly, in any other year, this might have ranked higher. But 2025 was stacked, as is so often the case. Like in my 2023 films list, I had an animated film list. I had an animated top 10 and I had a live action top 10. I ended up with 2 separate top 10 lists. Number 10, Wicked for Good. Now let's address the obvious first. This had impossible expectations. It's the second half of one of the most beloved stage musicals of all time. And it's following a record-breaking first film that won 2 Oscars last year. And it has to land some of the most emotionally devastating material in modern musical theatre. And it has to justify splitting the story into 2 cinematic events. And somehow, it mostly pulls it off. What Wicked for Good understands better than a lot of blockbuster adaptations is that this isn't really a spectacle story. It's a fracture story. The spectacle is there. That's a given. The production design is still just as lush and storybook operatic. Oz feels less like a fantasy setting and more like a political state in quiet collapse. The Emerald City especially shifts visually, colder, more sterile, more authoritarian. And you feel the tightening grip of the wizard's regime in the architecture itself. But the real engine of the film is the emotional fallout between Elphaba and Glinda. Part 1 was about collision, opposites being forced together. Part 2 is about consequence. The for good section of the story has always been the emotional core of Wicked on stage. Everybody knows Defying Gravity, everybody knows Popular. This is where the emotion starts to hit home. The film leans into the emotional core of this stage musical, and it leans into that intimacy. The camera gets closer, the framing softens, the grandiosity dials back at exactly the right moments. And the performances, this is where the film really earns its place on my list. Cynthia Erivo's Elphaba carries a kind of exhausting defiance here. She's not the wide-eyed outsider anymore. She's hardened, wounded, resolute. There's a subtle shift in her physicality, shoulders tighter, voice more controlled until it isn't. And when it breaks, man, it really breaks. And then, Ariana Grande's Glinda. This is the biggest surprise in this half. The comedic brightness from the first film evolves into something more fragile. Her performance understands that Glinda's tragedy isn't exile, it's complicity. And the way the film frames her choices adds layers that the stage version sometimes rushes past. And then there's For Good, the title track of this film. It would have been so easy to overshoot it, drown it in swelling strings and reaction shots. And instead, the sequence plays with restraint. Longer takes, fewer cuts, letting the silence between lines land. And it feels less like a showstopper and more like a reckoning. That said, and this is why it lands at number 10 and not any higher, the film does occasionally struggle with pacing in its final act. Some of the political threads feel simplified, a few transitions between large-scale set pieces and intimate moments don't always feel seamless. But when it works, man, it really works. And what ultimately secured its place in my top 10 isn't just the technical craft, it's the way it reframes the Wizard of Oz mythology as a story about narrative control, about who gets labelled wicked, about how history is written by the powerful. It's blockbuster filmmaking that still wants to integrate something. And in a year full of bold swings, that counts. So yes, it does sit at number 10, not because it's small, but because 2025 somehow gave us 9 films that hit me even harder. If number 10 was about legacy and expectation, number 9 is about risk. And I need to say this up front. I could only include one live action remake on this list. Not because there weren't any other solid attempts. Not because I'm anti-remake on principle. Stop making live action remakes! They're soulless and lazy! Is what most of the comments are going to be saying right now. But because if a remake is going to earn a spot on my top 10 of the year, especially in a year this competitive, it has to justify its existence artistically. Not just commercially, not just nostalgically. It has to do more than recreate. And the one that did that for me is the remake of How to Train Your Dragon. Now let's address the proverbial dragon in the room. This is one of the most beloved animated films of the 2010s. The original is near perfect in structure, emotional clarity, and score integration. Case in point, Test Drive, one of the best pieces of film music I've heard from the 2010 decade. So when a live action remake was announced, my first reaction wasn't excitement. It was suspicion. Because what do you improve? What do you reinterpret? What's the angle? And surprisingly, the answer wasn't make it bigger. It was make it heavier. The live action version leans into the Viking harshness of the book in a way animation only hinted at. The textures feel more brutal. The weather bites harder. The world feels physically dangerous. When dragons attack, it doesn't feel like spectacle, it feels like survival. And that shift in tone reframes the entire Hiccup story. In animation, his alienation is emotional and comedic. Here, it feels generational, cultural, almost political. The divide between strength and sensitivity hits differently when you can see the scars on the warriors. When Stoic isn't just a booming animated presence, but a father whose expectations carry weight, literal and psychological. Thank goodness they got Gerard Butler back as Stoic. I'm really glad they did that. And then there's Toothless. This was the make or break element of this remake. If Toothless looked wrong, moved wrong, felt wrong, the whole film could have absolutely collapsed. Instead, they made the smart choice. Retain his feline expressiveness, but ground his movement in animal realism. He feels tangible, and when he and Hiccup connect for the first time, there's a bit of hesitation, curiosity, breath. It's slower, more intimate, and that scene, it still works, maybe even more now, because it feels fragile. What ultimately earned this remake its place at number 9 is that it understands the core of the original wasn't dragon battles, it was empathy. And instead of trying to outdo the animated film's flight sequences, which honestly are untouchable, again, test drive, need I say more? This version doubles down on emotional realism. The flight scenes are still exhilarating, especially when you see them in either in 3D and in the 4DX screens at Cineworld. You feel like you're on the back of those dragons, taking flight, and that score from John Powell just soaring in the most incredible way possible. They're framed less like fantasy wish fulfillment and more like liberation. Escape from inherited identity. Is it perfect? No. There are moments where you can feel the blueprint underneath. A few beats land predictably because we've lived with this story for over a decade now. But here's the thing. I left the cinema not feeling like I watched a corporate echo. I felt like I watched a reinterpretation. And this is what I brought up when I discussed the Little Mermaid live-action remake. I didn't go into it seeing it as a remake of the beloved Disney classic. I saw it as another adaptation of Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale. And that, to me, helped me enjoy it more. In a landscape flooded with remakes, that distinction matters. That's why it's the only live-action remake that made my top 10. So, if number 9 was about reimagining a beloved animated classic, then number 8 is about finally putting fear back on the big screen. And doing it in a way that managed to surprise even a jaded horror fan like myself. Number 8, Final Destination Bloodlines. This isn't just another sequel in a long-running franchise, it's the first major Final Destination film in well over a decade. And it comes back not by retreading old ground, but by unlocking new lore, grounding its horror in generational consequence, and ultimately elevating what could have been a simple nostalgia cash-in into something surprisingly thoughtful. But here's the heart of why Bloodlines earned its way onto my list. The late Tony Todd returns as William Bloodworth, a character horror fans know instantly. Candyman being one of his most prolific roles. And William Bloodworth is a character that horror fans like myself know very well by this point, especially if you're a fan of the Final Destination franchise. The enigmatic mortician who seems to understand death better than anyone else in the franchise. This film marks Todd's final on-screen performance, and the way the filmmakers handled it is beyond meaningful. It's moving. Knowing that he was battling terminal illness during production, the directors actually encouraged him to depart from the script in his pivotal scene. They asked him to speak from the heart, to say what he, Tony Todd, would want audiences to hear about life and death. And he did, in, for me, one of my favourite scenes of 2025. The result isn't just a character moment in a horror movie, it's a farewell. Todd delivers a monologue that stops the mayhem cold and reminds the audiences that beyond the clever Rube Goldberg kills and panic-inducing build-ups, these movies are ultimately about how precious and fragile life really is. For long-time fans, seeing Bloodworth return after more than a decade isn't just fan service. It's closure, history, and legacy. It's a surprisingly tender counterpoint to a franchise built on gruesome, unavoidable death, which it also delivers here. Those deaths are gnarly those deaths are gnarly to witness. That opening premonition, yikes! There's a reason that skyline is in that poster. Now, I won't lie. When most horror reboots bring back an icon, it's often as a cash grab. Looking at the 2022, I think, Texas Chainsaw Massacre film for Netflix. They brought back Sally Hardesty and then killed her off. And even then that remake wasn't even that good. Reboot, whatever. But in Bloodlines, Tony Todd's presence doesn't just anchor the film, it elevates it. That layer of context, an actor's final curtain, turns what could have been another sequence of violent set pieces into something that resonates long after the credits roll. That emotional weight, paired with some of the most inventive set pieces in the Final Destination series, is why Bloodlines sneaks into my number 8 spot. But if number 8 was about legacy in horror, number 7 is about legacy in action. But filtered through satire, paranoia, and one of the most distinctive directors working today. Number 7 is The Running Man. Yes, that Running Man. The 80s cult classic with Arnold Schwarzenegger, neon spandex, that is not spandex! And game show Gladiators! But this 2025 version isn't just a remake of the film. It goes back to the source, the Running Man novel, written under Stephen King's Richard Bachman pseudonym. It leans much harder into the dystopian satire that the original movie mostly turned into muscular camp. And who better to tackle corporate spectacle, media manipulation, and state-sanctioned entertainment than Edgar Wright? The same Edgar Wright who did the Cornetto trilogy. So what's the plan with his remake of The Running Man? Oh yes, we take Pete's car, we go to Mum's, we go in, we kill Phil, we grab Liz, we go to the Winchester, we have a nice cold pint, and we wait for all this to blow over. So I have to quote, I feel the need to quote Shaun of the Dead every time someone mentions what the plan is. Oh, I love it. Shaun of the Dead is my favourite of the Cornetto trilogy. So, what makes this version work, and what earns it a spot on my list, is how clearly it feels like an Edgar Wright film without feeling like he's repeating himself. You still get the kinetic editing, the rhythmic smash cuts, the way sound design syncs with movement, doors slamming on beat, guns reload, punctuating dialogue, broadcast glitches cutting like drum fills. But here, that hyper-precision isn't playful, it's oppressive. The game show elements are edited like propaganda reels. The live audience reactions are cut with this almost algorithmic rhythm. Applause, sponsor graphics, instant replay violence, creating a sense that the entire society exists inside a feedback loop of distraction. Wright uses his trademark momentum not for comedy this time, but for anxiety. And when the film slows down, when it follows our protagonist off-grid, away from the cameras, the visual language changes. Longer takes, less stylization. The absence of that rhythmic editing suddenly feels like oxygen. It's such a smart formal choice. But unlike the 87 film, This version isn't interested in one-liners or camp villains,
where I hope you leave enough room for my fist, because I am going to ram it into your stomach and break your goddamn spine!
It's much closer to King's original idea. A desperate man navigating a country that's weaponized poverty and turned survival into primetime television. The satire hits harder because it doesn't feel exaggerated anymore. The corporate sponsorship jokes, not jokes. The media manipulation feels familiar. The gamified outrage cycle, a little too on the nose, in a good way. And Wright balances all of that with tension that actually builds. The chase sequences are chaotic but coherent. Geography matters. Stakes feel real. You're not watching a cartoon gladiator match. You're watching a system hunt someone down. Is it perfect? No. There are moments where the style almost overwhelms the emotional core. And if you're expecting pure 1980s throwback energy, this is going to feel colder, sharper, and more cynical. But that's exactly why it landed here for me. It's a remake that understands its history, respects the source material, and then updates it with a directorial voice that feels intentional rather than nostalgic. With number 7 being about a society that hunts people down for entertainment, number 6 is about a world that already ended and what crawled out of the ruins. Number 6, 28 years later. And I'll be honest, I went into this one with equal parts excitement and fear. Because 28 Days Later isn't just a horror movie, it's foundational. It rewired what modern zombie cinema could look and feel like. The digital grit, the sprinting infected, the empty London imagery, it changed the genre. Then, 28 weeks later, expanded the scale, leaned into military containment, and pushed the franchise into bigger, more explosive territory. So when 28 years later was announced, bringing back Danny Boyle and Alex Garland, the question wasn't, can they make another one? It was, why now? And the answer became pretty clear early on. This isn't a nostalgic sequel. It's not trying to recreate the shock of the original Outbreak. It's about the aftermath, about memory, about a generation that didn't see the beginning of the Rage virus, but inherited the consequences of it. The infected are still terrifying, fast, brutal, relentless, but the film is less interested in jump scares and more interested in the societal scar tissue. The world feels fragmented. Communities have formed with their own rules, their own mythologies about what happened. There's this eerie sense that the virus isn't just biological anymore. It's cultural. And visually, it goes back to that raw immediacy that made the first film so unsettling. The camera often feels handheld, invasive, too close. There's a documentary-like discomfort to it. When violence erupts, it's sudden and ugly. Not choreographed, not heroic. But what really got me, what locks it in at number 6, is the emotional undercurrent. There's a quiet grief running through this film, not just for the dead, but for the version of the world that can never come back. Characters aren't just fighting to survive, they're negotiating what survival even means, decades after collapse. It feels older, wiser, more reflective, and yet, when it wants to terrify you, it absolutely does. There are sequences here that had my entire cinema screen holding its breath. That primal, don't make a sound tension that the original mastered. It's back. So why number 6 and not higher? Because as powerful as it is, it's deliberately restrained. It's less explosive than Weeks, less revolutionary than Days. It's operating in legacy mode, but doing it with intention. And in a year with bold swings, sometimes maturity lands right in the middle of the list. Before we get into the top 5, we need to talk about the ones that almost made the list. If I had enough honorable mentions on me, I could have had a separate top 10 of the films that didn't quite make it. These are films that I did genuinely like, in some cases really admired, but for one reason or another, just didn't quite crack the final list. First up, the Lilo and Stitch remake. This had heart. Look, this had heart. More heart than I expected, actually. The live-action remake leans heavily into the emotional core of the original. Grief, sisterhood, found family, and for the most part, that works. Lilo still feels weird in the way that matters. Stitch is still just as chaotic, but also vulnerable. And the Hawaii setting feels textured and warm rather than green-screened into oblivion. But here's the thing. It never fully escaped the shadow of the original animated film. It was good, it was sincere, it just didn't reinvent enough to demand a top 10 slot in a year this competitive. And then there's Zootopia 2, or Zootropolis 2 here in the UK. This one really frustrates me, because it's so close to being great. The world building is still sharp, the animation is still gorgeous, the social satire is laid in that very family-friendly but pointed way that the first film mastered. But Paul Burt, the new character positioned as someone trying to break away from his family expectations, feels like a missed opportunity. This film set him up to rebel, to choose a different path, to challenge the generational cycle. And then, it doesn't quite commit. Instead of allowing him to meaningfully diverge, the story circles back to him essentially becoming a slightly polished version of the same legacy he was just trying to escape. It's thematically safe, and in a sequel that had the chance to interrogate systemic identity even further, safe felt safe, and it felt like a letdown as a result. Avatar: Fire and Ash is next. James Cameron continues to operate on a technical plane that most studios can't even see from the ground. The volcano biomes are stunning. The fire and ash aesthetics contrast beautifully with Pandora's usual bioluminescent palette. But emotionally, doesn't quite land. Because, look, here's the thing. The first film, forest, earth. Second film, water. Third film, and then everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked. That gang never gets old. Other than that, everything remains the same, plot-wise. While it's impressive in some areas, it just didn't linger. Dogman was an absolute delight. Pure chaotic energy, visual inventiveness that feels like it leapt straight off the page of Dave Pilkey's books. It's loud, it's silly, it knows exactly what it is, but But ultimately, it's a children's comedy operating at a children's comedy level. And while that's not a criticism, it means it didn't emotionally compete with some of the heavy hitters on this list. Still, I had a blast. And now we need to talk about Captain America: Brave New World. This one is complicated. On paper, it had everything going for it. A new Captain America stepping into political turbulence. A fractured America, a conspiracy-tinged tone. But for me, it leaned too far into overt political messaging without the narrative subtlety to balance it. It feels less like a character-driven exploration and more like a headline reactive script at times. And I have to say it, the marketing teased Red Hulk so heavily, and when you build that much anticipation around something, when the trailers frame it as a seismic shift, the payoff has to feel monumental. And yet, it didn't. The underuse of Red Hulk made the climax feel smaller than the promise. I didn't hate it, I just walked out underwhelmed. And finally, Elio. Now, this one is special. because I've already gone into great lengths with this film. Because if you've watched this particular episode of The Kingdom of Isolation, or if you've been following The Kingdom of Isolation for a while now, you already know how much this film means to me. I've talked about it extensively, about its themes of alienation, belonging, and the fantasy of being chosen by somewhere else because Earth just doesn't feel like home. It absolutely could have been in the top 10. But I've already said everything I need to say about it in that episode of The Kingdom of Isolation. So, if you want to hear my thoughts, if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts of this film, you can check out my Kingdom of Isolation episode on Elio after this. No more, that was fun. No more, that almost made it. From this point on, these films didn't just impress me. They meant something. And number 5 is deeply personal for me. Hans Zimmer and Friends, Diamond in the Desert. Now, technically, yes, this is a concert film. But I had to include this on this list. This isn't just a recording of a live show, it's a celebration of one of the most influential composers in modern cinema. I don't use that word lightly. Hans Zimmer is someone I've idolized for as long as I've paid attention to film music. His scores were some of the first times I understood that sound could be storytelling, that music could create tension before a character even moved, that a theme could break your heart before a line of dialogue ever tried to. From the swelling melancholy of Interstellar, to the ticking anxiety of Dunkirk, to the operatic scale of Gladiator. Are you not entertained? His work doesn't just accompany images, it defines them. And Diamond in the Desert captures that legacy in a way that feels grand but intimate at the same time. The staging is massive, desert backdrops, sweeping lights, a full orchestra that feels mythic in scale. But the film keeps cutting to these quieter moments. Zimmer talking about collaboration, about creative doubt, about the process, and it humanizes the legend. There's something surreal about watching the themes you've lived with for years, performed live, not just as background noise to a film, but as the main event itself. You realize how architectural these compositions are, how they build layer by layer until they swallow the room whole. And here's where it stops being abstract for me. I got to see Hans Zimmer live, in concert, with my best friend. Monday, November 24th, 2025, the Glasgow OVO Hydro. I don't throw around unforgettable lightly, but that night genuinely was. There's a specific kind of magic that happens when music you love becomes communal. When thousands of people inhale at the same cue, when a familiar motif begins and you feel the air shift before the melody even lands. We looked at each other during one of the big crescendos. The kind that rattles your ribs and you just know you're going to remember that moment years from now. Not because it was loud, but because it was shared. That's why it sits at number 5. It's not about craft, though the craft is extraordinary. The scale of these shows is unbelievable. It's unreal. It's about memory. It's about the way the film music can thread itself through your life and then suddenly exist in the same physical space as you. Some films define a year, but this one felt like it defined a chapter. So if number 5 was about celebrating a composer, number 4 It's about what happens when that compose you straps you into a car and goes at 200 miles an hour. Brian Tyler? Actually, let's use this. That's more like it. Yep, number 4 is the F1 movie. And yes, this is absolutely my excuse to continue talking about Hans Zimmer, gushing about his work. This is absolutely my excuse to keep talking about Hans Zimmer. Because why not? He's my favorite film composer. Because what he does here is completely different to Diamond in the Desert. This isn't sweeping space melancholy. This isn't historical grandeur. This is mechanical. It's relentless, percussive in a way that feels engineered rather than orchestrated. The score mirrors the sport itself, pulses like an engine revving on the grid, builds tension like tide degradation over a long stint. There are stretches where the music almost fuses with the sound design, gear shifts, downshifts, and the whine of the power unit, until you can't tell where the car ends and the score begins. And as someone who's a lifelong F1 fan, that detail matters. But what really pushed F1 into the top 5, what made it feel authentic rather than Hollywood glossy, is the involvement of the F1 paddock. Stefano Domenicali, Toto Wolff, Lewis Hamilton. And you can feel that influence all over this film. The paddock dynamics, the politics between teams, the quiet intensity before David Croft shouts "lights out" and away we go. Speaking of which, this is the masterstroke of the film. David Croft and Martin Brundle providing the commentary during the race sequences. That choice alone elevates the racing scenes from cinematic spectacle to something that feels genuinely lived in. For longtime F1 fans like myself, hearing those voices we have grown to be around on Sunday afternoons. Rest in peace, Murray Walker. Miss you every day. For lifelong F1 fans like myself, hearing Crofty's voice rise during an overtake attempt, Brundle dissecting race strategy, instantly grounds the film in reality. It's familiar, it's textured, it feels like a Grand Prix weekend. But this is the clever part, it also feels accessible. Because if you're part of that newer wave of fans who got into the sport over the last few years thanks to Drive to Survive, whether it was through streaming, again, Drive to Survive, seeing all those social media clips, or just cultural momentum, that commentary acts as an entry point. It explains without over-explaining, it heightens tension without bogging down the narrative. The film balances authenticity and spectacle in a way that's really difficult to pull off. The racing scenes are visceral, low camera angles, cockpit perspectives. They had to use a helicopter instead of a drone to be able to get the sweeping shots of the cars going around those corners. And we see that in the opening credits. The claustrophobia of the Halo device framing, everything. You feel the speed, the G-force. And there's a sequence midway through the film that genuinely had me gripping the armrest like it was Sunday lights out and away we go. And I'm gonna go into spoilers for this bit. Monza. In the wet. Joshua Pierce chasing Max Verstappen down. The music just building and building and building. And then the moment hits. Seeing that film for the first time around fellow F1 fans. The audible gasp I let out in that moment was... it had shades of that crash in Formula 3 just a week after what happened in Belgium in 2019 with the passing of Antoine Hubert and the horrific injuries that Juan Manuel Correa sustained in that crash. I remember going into commentary for Talk of the Devil, a racing league that I was part of for a while. Everybody was shaken, including myself. That loss still hurts to this day. But it's what happens after that moment in the film, where the car bursts into flames. Romain Grosjean, Bahrain 2020. My exact words were, "Oh God," as soon as that fireball erupted. Scenes like that show that no matter how safe you can make a sport, like Formula One, danger will never be far away. There's always going to be danger around every corner. You're never going to eliminate the danger of the sport altogether. But we can still do everything we can to make it as safe as possible so that we do not encounter weekends like that again. Weekends where drivers' careers end, and in some cases, worse. This film never forgets that Formula One isn't just about speed. It's about pressure, Sonny Hayes, the team politics, the legacy. He wasn't a has-been, he was a never was. It's about the mental toll of knowing one mistake happens at 200 miles an hour. And that one mistake can change everything. Is it perfect? No. There are moments where the drama leans slightly into sports movie familiarity. You can sometimes see the arc coming a lap before it arrives, but when the engines roar and Zimmer's score kicks in underneath Crofty's commentary, it's electric. This film isn't here just because it's a good racing film. And I'm not just saying that because I'm an F1 fan. It's here because it understands the culture of the sport and it respects it. It captured the mainstream while capturing the authenticity of the sport alongside fans new and old. If number 4 was about horsepower, legacy teams, and billion-dollar machinery, number 3 is the complete opposite. No engines, no franchises, no corporate IP, just pure cinematic artistry. Number 3 is flow. And I love this one for what it represents almost as much as I love it for what it is. Because flow isn't backed by a major animation studio pipeline. It wasn't built inside a corporate ecosystem with thousands of artists and proprietary rendering tech. It was created using Blender, open source software. In an era where animation budgets balloon into the hundreds of millions, here's an independent animated film. No dialogue throughout the entire film. It's an animated film proving that tools do not define imagination. And just to make the story even better, it went on to win Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. Not because it was loud, not because it was brand recognition, but because it was undeniable. What makes Flow extraordinary isn't just its production story, it's its restraint. The film tells its story almost entirely. Well, the film tells its story entirely without dialogue. It trusts movement, environment, expression. It understands that animation doesn't need quippy exposition to communicate emotion. There's a meditative quality to it. The pacing is deliberate. The landscape feels vast and almost lonely. In all its forms, it becomes both a literal and thematic current running through the film. And visually, there's something slightly raw about it. Not unfinished, intentional. The textures aren't hyper-polished in a way studio animation often is. Light behaves in ways that feel painterly rather than photoreal. It creates this dreamlike atmosphere that fits the tone perfectly. It's proof that animation doesn't have to chase realism to feel immersive. And thematically, Flow hits hard. It's about survival, it's about displacement, about adapting when the world around you refuses to stay still. There's no heavy-handed messaging, no grand villain monologues, just a quiet, persistent emotional pull that sneaks up on you. And I remember sitting there realizing about halfway through that I hadn't checked the time once. That I was just in it. And that's rare. In a year filled with franchise entries, legacy sequels, and blockbuster spectacle, Flow feels almost rebellious in its simplicity. It's not trying to dominate the box office, it's trying to move you. And the fact that a film with open source software stood on the Oscar stage and won, that's not just a win for the filmmakers. That's a win for independent animation and independent cinema as a whole. Number 3 isn't about scale. It's about purity. Right, here we go. The top 2. And I need you to understand that I swapped these spots constantly. I'm not even exaggerating when I say number 1 and number 2 positions changed places more than any other ranking on this list. I'd lock it in, feel confident, sleep on it, wake up, and then switch them again. That's how close this was. If I could have, I would have put these both at number 1. But I had to make a choice. And that's how impossible this decision was to make. Because both of these films didn't just impress me, they defined my year. But after all the rethinking, all the spiraling, all the overthinking, number 2 is K-pop Demon Hunters.
You what?
And yes, even saying that out loud still feels weird. Still feels wild. Because on paper, this sounds like a chaos pitch. A K-pop girl group being demon hunters? It's an animated musical with the animation style of the Spider-Verse films? And the soundtrack is K-pop?
Run, run, we run the town. Whole world playing our sound.
Somehow this shouldn't work, and yet it does. What makes this film work? What makes it land so high? Is that it never treats its premise like a gimmick. Huntrix, Rumi, Mira, Zoe, they don't feel like marketing archetypes. They don't feel like a studio checklist of girl boss traits stitched together to manufacture empowerment. They feel specific. They have insecurities. They have a rivalry with the Saja boys.
My little soda pop.
They feel the fatigue. They have that ambition. That quiet pressure of constantly being watched, not just by fans, but by an industry machine that profits off their perfection. The film understands that being idols and demon hunters aren't two separate identities. They are the same thing. Performance as armor, stage presence as weaponry, public image versus private exhaustion. And that thematic fusion is what elevates it beyond novelty. And then there's the soundtrack.
We're going up, it's our moment.
This wasn't just a fun movie. It dominated. The tracks climbed global charts. These songs were everywhere. Dance challenges exploding across social media. Even people who hadn't seen the film, they knew the hooks. The production isn't polished, but layered, blending K-pop precision with darker, almost industrial undertones during the action sequences. There are fight scenes choreographed around beats so tightly that the editing feels like a live concert and a supernatural thriller colliding in real time. And yet, underneath the spectacle, there's heart.
I broke into a million pieces and I can't go back.
A central emotional thread about loyalty, about what happens when your bond is tested, not by fame, but by fear. That's what kept me pulling back. That's what kept pulling me back. That's what made it so hard to push this to number 2 instead of number 1. Because when it hits big. It's stylish, it's unapologetic, it's culturally loud in the best way possible. And in almost any other year, this would have been my number 1. Without question. This would have been number 1 without hesitation. But there was one film that edged it out. One film that lingered in a slightly different, heavier way. But before we get to the number 1, we need to cleanse the palate a little bit, because not every 2025 release was a triumph. Some films didn't just miss my top 10. Oh boy, they actively frustrated me. These are the dishonorable mentions. So first up, Snow White. Where do I even start? The marketing rollout alone felt like a case study in how to alienate almost everyone about everything, everywhere, all at once. And I'll see myself out. The discourse spiraled before the film even was even released. And not in a healthy debate way. It felt messy, it felt reactive, it felt totally confused. And then there were the comments from Rachel Zegler about the original Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, myself included, as a lover of animation myself. Whether taken out of context or not, it came across as dismissive of a film that is foundational to animation history. This was the first ever animated film for Walt Disney Animation Studios. And that matters. You can reinterpret a classic, you can modernize it, but openly disrespecting its legacy while asking audiences to show up for your remake? Strange strategy, if you ask me. It's just going to encourage them to not go and see it instead. Gal Gadot? Oh boy! Everything going on with Israel and Palestine right now, having Gal Gadot involved in this film didn't exactly help matters either. And then there's the decision to replace the dwarves, because it's apparently offensive to call people dwarves, with fully CGI magical creatures. Now, I understand the complexities of representation discussions here. Speaking as somebody that's autistic, doesn't get a fair crack at life, is dismissed as somebody that can be disruptive rather than somebody that can actually be helpful. But instead of casting talented actors with dwarfism, and there are many, including people like Peter Dinklage and Warwick Davis, Tyrion Lannister, and Professor... Oh, what's the professor's name? What's the professor he plays? Damn it! He's Grip Hook as well. Flitwick! Professor Flitwick. Thanks, train of thought. Lost it there for a moment. Tyrion Lannister, Professor Flitwick, and Grip Hook. The film opted for uncanny, weightless CGI characters that never quite feel present in the same space as Snow White. And honestly, I would have loved to see Dinklage and Davis share the screen together in something like this. That could have been iconic. It could have reframed the conversation entirely, but instead, no, they had to go for the magical creatures who feel like a compromise that satisfies absolutely no one. And then, somehow, it stumbled at the box office. Twice! After underperforming initially, that's what happens when you screw up the marketing so badly. A re-release on Mothering Sunday weekend was meant to boost numbers. And it didn't! Bombing once is unfortunate, Treasure Planet being a primary case. But bombing twice, that's almost impressive. Looking at you, Morbius. Just because people turn you into a meme doesn't mean, oh, people are gonna want to go and see this now. No, it doesn't. Just because it becomes a meme, it's not necessarily a good thing. Looking at every single one of you calling Bella Ramsey a potato. And you all know who you are. And there, oh boy. It's not the worst film ever made, but it's one of the most mishandled major releases of the year. And this one I purposely kept in this dishonorable mention slot. Yes, it made a lot of money at the box office. Yes, there's another sequel on the way. But the reason why it is on the dishonorable mentions list section... Say the line, Steve! This was less about the film itself, which is perfectly serviceable family blockbuster fare, but more about what happened around it. That's why I played that clip. The chicken jockey fiasco. Those that know, they know. Screenings were disrupted because audiences were waiting for the chicken jockey moment like it was the Avengers assembling. People shouting, people filming, people even throwing popcorn everywhere. Giant bags of popcorn! Leaving an abnormal mess for the cinema staff to clean up afterwards. They had to deal with this. They had to deal with this for weeks. To the point where some cinemas even banned that demographic from going to see the movie in the evenings unless they were accompanied by an adult that was over 18. Some cinemas even resorted to putting a disclaimer telling them, yes, the chicken jockey is in the movie. It is not your cue to be a disruptive piece of scum. There were even reports of viewers being kicked out of mid-screenings for causing the chaos. No one to blame but yourselves for that. And yes, there was even a screening where someone brought an actual chicken into the cinema and showcased it to the world during the chicken jockey moment. It reached the point where cinemas reportedly had to put disclaimers before the film began, essentially warning those potential disruptors that yes, chicken jockey appears, and no, this is not your cue to turn the screening into a live event. And here's the thing, communal hype can be fun. The Avengers assemble, Cap holding the hammer, holding Mjolnir. The fan service of Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire with Tom Holland, all three Spider-Men on screen together for the very first time in No Way Home. But when it tips into disruption, when families can't watch the film they paid for because someone's chasing a meme moment, it becomes exhausting. The film became less about storytelling and more about internet spectacle. And that more than anything left a sour taste. So yes, those are the dishonorable mentions. Not catastrophic failures across the board, unless you're Snow White. But films defined more by controversy, chaos, and miscalculations than by craft. But Snow White failed on all those counts anyway. And now, there's only one film left. The one I kept switching with K-pop Demon Hunters. The one that won the war in my head. My number one film of 2025. So let's take a breath. Because this list has been chaotic. It's been emotional. It's been loud. It's been personal. Slightly unhinged at the best of times. And honestly, that feels really appropriate for 2025. So here we go, let's recap the top 10 so far. Number 10, Wicked for Good. Number 9, How to Train Your Dragon. Number 8, Final Destination Bloodlines. Number 7, The Running Man. Number 6, 28 Years Later. Number 5, Hans Zimmer and Friends, Diamond in the Desert. Number 4, F1 the Movie. Number 3, Flow. And number 2, K-pop Demon Hunters. 10 films, 10 completely different tones. Blockbusters, indie animation, horror sequels, sports dramas, a concert documentary, a dystopian remake. And somehow they all coexist in the same cinematic year. That's what makes narrowing it down to this list so difficult. Especially choosing my number one. But choosing number one isn't just about quality. It's about impact. It's about what stayed with me longest. What I kept thinking about, what refused to let go. And after all the swapping, all the re-ranking, there's only one film left standing. Number one is Sinners. Sinners isn't flashy in the way some of the other films on this list are. It doesn't rely on spectacle to overwhelm you. It's controlled, intimate, precise. Every frame feels intentional. The performances are layered, not showy, not desperate for award attention, just deeply human. The script trusts silence. It trusts discomfort. It lets tension build in small glances and unfinished sentences rather than explosive monologues. And when it escalates, it devastates. What ultimately pushed it above K-pop Demon Hunters for me, and believe me, that was not an easy decision to make, is longevity. I kept thinking about Sinners days later, about its moral ambiguity, about the weight of its choices. It's a film that lingers. And then there's the scale, because seeing this in IMAX, that changed everything. You can actually see the moments where the aspect ratio changes. It's about moral ambiguity, which I've already mentioned. The framing feels immersive in a way that almost traps you inside the moral pressure cooker of this story. It's one of those rare films where the IMAX format doesn't just make it feel bigger, it makes it heavier. And then, as if the impact wasn't already undeniable, we're in the middle of awards season right now, at time of recording. Sinners broke records with 16 Oscar nominations. The most nominations ever received by a single film in Academy Awards history. That's not hype. That is seismic. But the nominations aren't why it's number one. They are confirmation. Confirmation of what I felt sitting in that IMAX auditorium. That I was watching something special. Something crafted with intention. Something bold but controlled. Something that didn't beg for attention. It commanded it. And that's why, after all the switching and second guessing, Sinners wins. When I look back at 2025, I don't just see a list. I see a year that felt strangely transitional. Not just for cinema, but for how we experience cinema. This was a year where open source animation won at the Oscars, where a concert film made my top 5 because the communal experience mattered as much as the craft, where a horror sequel delivered a farewell that felt deeply human to an absolute icon of the industry, where a K-pop supernatural action film dominated global music charts, where a racing film felt authentic enough for die-hard fans but welcoming enough for newcomers, and at the same time it was also a year of remakes struggling to justify themselves, marketing campaigns imploding before release date, internet meme culture spilling into cinemas in ways that felt chaotic rather than communal. It felt like the industry is still figuring itself out. There's this push and pull happening right now, between spectacle and substance, between nostalgia and reinvention, between algorithm and artistry. And what excites me about 2025 is that for all its messiness, artistry still won. Flow proved you don't need a mega studio machine to move people. Sinners proved that audiences will show up for something challenging and morally complex. K-pop Demon Hunters proved that genre-blending chaos can become cultural dominance if it's made with conviction. Even films that didn't make the list sparked conversations about representation, authenticity, how audiences behave in shared spaces. And that's the thing. Cinema isn't just what's on screen anymore. It's how we show up for it, how we argue about it, how we carry it with us afterwards. This year reminded me why I love going to the cinema. Because as much as streaming is convenient, nothing replaces that moment when the lights dim and you're sitting in a room full of strangers about to feel something at the same time. Whether it's the silence after a devastating scene in Sinners, the collective adrenaline rush during an overtaken F1, the entire theatre holding its breath during 28 years later, or thousands of people at a concert, a Hans Zimmer concert, like it's a religious experience. That shared energy is irreplaceable. And personally, 2025 was a year where film definitely felt personal again. It wasn't just content to consume. It was something to wrestle with, to debate with, to re-rank 14 times at midnight because you suddenly changed your mind. It challenged me. It surprised me. It reminded me that even in an era of sequels, remakes, and franchise fatigue, original voices and bold risks can still break through. So maybe this year wasn't a perfect year, but it certainly was a fascinating one. And if this is the direction cinema is heading, messy, experimental, occasionally chaotic, but still capable of greatness, then I'm excited for what 2026 brings. And that's my top 10. And that is my year in film. Now, it's all down to you guys. I want to hear your thoughts in the comments. What was your film of the year? Was it K-pop Demon Hunters? Was it Sinners? Was it Wicked for Good? Was it something else entirely? Let me know in the comments. I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say. If you enjoyed this list, thumbs up. And if you want to keep up to date with everything movie related on here, you can subscribe, click the bell, turn on notifications so you don't miss when anything goes live on this channel. So, I'm still in the middle of preparing my first episode of the DreamWorks Diaries. So, forgive the prolonged absence of the DreamWorks Diaries and Kingdom of Isolation. They will return. And I'll have them back in March. So, we're going to have Ants for the first. We're going to have Ants for the first episode of the DreamWorks Diaries. And in the Kingdom of Isolation, we start our live action remakes as we look at Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book. Now, thankfully, I don't have as many live action remakes to go through compared to the DreamWorks Diaries. So the DreamWorks Diaries might take a couple of years to finish. But rest assured, I'll be there with you guys every step of the way. I'm going to alternate between DreamWorks Diaries and Kingdom of Isolation. 1 week it'll be DreamWorks Diaries, 1 week it'll be Kingdom of Isolation. So that's what's going to happen from March. This year's Kingdom of Isolation Anniversary Special is going to be centered around paying tribute to Disney Toon Studios, because I somehow managed to cover all their films in the entire calendar year of 2025. I don't know how I managed it, but somehow I did. So, who knows what 2026 has in store? But all I can say is, bring it on. I'm ready for what 2026 has in store. And as my philosophy says, make each moment count. And I'll see you guys next time.